The film introduction contains several photographs of President Kennedy and President Johnson, addressing crowds, meeting with key leaders, and at work in their offices.
Hello, folks, and thanks
A uniformed park ranger in front of a visual background of JFK's birthplace, a gray, three-story house with dark green shutters.
Joe Owen, who is from Lyndon B. Johnson National Historic Park, rather. Joe, how are you today?
I'm doing good, doing good.
Good to see you. And as folks are well aware, we are doing a series of episodes entitled The New Frontier and the Great Society, an examination of the lives, presidencies, and legacies of JFK and LBJ. We've spent the last couple episodes focusing on the presidencies, first of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and then moving on to LBJ. Today, we're going to focus exclusively on the issue of civil rights. And today's episode is called We Shall Overcome, the Civil Rights Legacies of JFK and LBJ. So we're going to jump right into things here. Joe, we'll start with you first, then I'll chime in after that. What kind of exposure slash knowledge did LBJ have of issues connected to racism, discrimination, and civil rights struggles as a young person?
Well,
a uniformed park ranger sits in front of a blue-gray background with a wooden door and hanging picture frames.
And Reconstruction definitely had an imprint on the Texas Hill Country. And as a young man, growing up in the Texas Hill Country, LBJ saw prejudice with his father's workers. Sam Johnson, like I said in previous episodes, Sam Johnson was a farmer at what is today the LBJ Ranch, and Sam had to hire poor migrants, Mexican migrants, and he saw how tough their life was. He saw how discriminated against they were. LBJ said he could identify with them because he felt his family was outsiders too, because of the economic situation of Sam Jr. losing pretty much all the family money in farming. And when the farming at the ranch was a failure for cotton crops, Sam Jr., who did raise cotton, when that failed, they didn't have any money and they had to move to Johnson City, Texas, pretty much like a tail between their legs. And with society at the time, people in Johnson City, they knew Lyndon Johnson's mother, Rebecca, was a teacher, but they said they put up airs, that she put up airs that she thought she was better than everybody else. And so when the family lost money, they were chastised, they were outcast, and Lyndon Johnson never forgot that. He thought he said he could identify with minorities because they were outcasts. They were not part of society. And he felt like he wasn't either. He understood about the educational parts as well. Minorities did not get overall, they did not get a high quality education from what Lyndon Johnson was saying. Like I said, when he was a principal before he graduated from Southwest Texas Teachers College in San Marcos, he was a principal at a school down in Cotulla, Texas. He understood how disadvantaged it was for these Mexican children to learn. He had to buy necessities, lunch and food out of his own pockets for these kids. And he saw firsthand how prejudice was. He lived it, he said. His father, Sam, was a state senator. He went with his father, Lyndon Johnson did, throughout these small towns in Texas, and he saw prejudice firsthand. And his father's influence on the civil rights for everybody. Sam Johnson Jr. was a proponent of civil rights in the South, when it was definitely not the thing to be vocal about. And he didn't care. That influenced Lyndon Johnson. It really did throughout his life. Lyndon Johnson was politically savvy.
Black and white photo of President Johnson standing toe-to-toe with Senator Richard Russell in the White House Cabinet Room, 1963.
And so when the Civil Rights Bill came up and he wanted to pass it, it was a big shock to everybody. It's a big shock to his fellow senators. They never knew that Lyndon Johnson was so passionate about it. He might have made some rumblings, they thought, but they never thought in a million years that he would ever try to have a civil rights bill passed. But he got on board in the previous episode, like we said, he got on board President John Kennedy's civil rights agenda. So Lyndon Johnson's background, he felt that he can identify with the African Americans, with Asian Americans, with Hispanic Americans about being outcast, not having the high quality that they should in education. And in social programs. And so that really had an effect on Lyndon Johnson.
Yeah, just to piggyback off of the conversation here, and I think we didn't really talk too much about this in the Great Society episode, but you also have significant immigration reform legislation passed in '65, which echoes some of the statements that you were just making. And I think the fact that Johnson goes to the Statue of Liberty and literally stands in the shadow of this symbol of welcoming really almost is kind of closing the circle on his own experiences, but also his father, as you suggested as well, sticking up for folks, people like the German folks who were in Texas at this time, but also Mexican Americans as well. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, you have John Fitzgerald Kennedy, who never really saw poverty from a personal experience. I think John F. Kennedy struggles more with his health, which is going to impact his views about the underdog and how difficult it is to struggle. And I think too, being someone who is a practicing Catholic, will experience prejudice in some way, shape, or form. Jack Kennedy, as a young man, is going to be exposed to some elements of anti-Semitism from a lot of the comments that his father is going to make, but he's able to rise above a lot of that. But generally speaking, I think Jack Kennedy's complicated early on in the sense that he does have exposure to folks who are people of color, but isn't necessarily putting the issues of these folks on the front burner. In his 46 campaign for Congress, and when he's in the Senate early on, he's definitely paying attention to issues. There's a famous moment in 46 where he actually goes to a dedication of a memorial for two Black veterans here in the Boston area. But Joe, as you're sort of getting at, by and large, Jack Kennedy is wanting to steer kind of down the middle, wants to be accepted. And as he moves from the House into the Senate, he is well aware that white Southern Democrats control a lot of positions of power, so he doesn't want to rock the boat. And you kind of hinted this a little bit in the sense that the civil rights records of both of these gentlemen are sort of mixed. LBJ will help to
Black and white photo of President Johnson sitting with civil rights leaders, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Whitney Young, and James Farmer in the Oval Office, 1965.
Looking at his own political fortunes, but they needed to send federal troops. And so, to his credit, he is going to use the power of the federal government and begins to realize, and I would argue, by the time we get to the spring of 1963, between the political pressure that's being placed in the administration by Black folks and whites who are sympathetic to what's going on, and also him witnessing things that are happening in Birmingham, where you have young people who are literally being forced, sprayed down by being attacked by German shepherds put out there by Bull Connor, that much like many other Americans, he begins to recognize that things need to change. And so you have that very famous speech.
Black and white photo of President Kennedy giving a televised address from his desk in the Oval Office with a TV crew present.
You probably know this, is that the speech is largely improvised. He writes elements of it. Ted Sorensen helps him out. But if you watch the speech, and it's not particularly long, you can see him speaking from the heart and very much frames the issue of civil rights as a moral issue. Not looking at it from a legal standpoint, but calling on people across the country to put themselves in the place of those folks who have been discriminated against. Place themselves in the place of folks who are
March 15th, 1965. President Lyndon B. Johnson's special address to Congress on voting rights.
Citizen. And again, he makes this speech, and it's definitely a transformative moment. Of course, you have the March on Washington.
Colored photo of President Kennedy with multiple March on Washington leaders in the Oval Office.
Then, of course, he'll be assassinated in November of 1963. So you have that legislation get introduced, but then get stalled, right? And as a result of that, you have a situation where LBJ has to step up and deal with it. One point I wanted to make, there we go. One point I do want to make is, and Joe, I'm curious to your thoughts.
Sure.
LBJ actually makes a really interesting speech in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania.
Yes, he does.
And so I don't know if you want to talk a bit about that in terms of kind of setting the stage for not only John F. Kennedy's address, but to a certain extent, it connects quite well with what Dr. King says in August of 1963.
You bet. When John Kennedy was there shortly before he was killed in Dallas, he was at the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, and that's when Abraham Lincoln made a speech in November of 1863. And I think Lyndon Johnson took advantage of that, about all men are created equal, that kind of thought, that kind of philosophy. And Lyndon Johnson did go to Gettysburg because he was during the Civil Rights Movement, and he understood how powerful figure Abraham Lincoln was with acknowledging and abolishing slavery, the 14th, 15th Amendment. And he wanted to prove a point that he was also a speaker for Abraham Lincoln, that he was carrying the mantle of the Gettysburg Address, the 7 years, the great nations shall not perish from this earth. And Lyndon Johnson tied that in with civil rights, I believe. He wanted people to understand that having a great country, it meant equality for all. It meant opportunities for all, because that way everybody could take advantages of having a prosperous life. And the Gettysburg with President Kennedy and with President Johnson, there's no more a perfect place than to talk about civil rights than the battle that would turn the tide of the Civil War to the North, to the United States against the Confederacy. And Lyndon Johnson was very keen aware about the South's sensitivities about that as well. And so with the speeches about at Gettysburg, he wanted to have the attention about talking about civil rights. And there's no more of a better place than to have it there than at Gettysburg National Military Park.
Yeah, well said. And I have a brief excerpt of the speech. And I would encourage folks to go and read the speech itself. But part of the speech, he says, this is Lyndon Johnson, this is May 30th, 1963. Until justice is blinded to color, until all education is unaware of race, until opportunity is unconnected with the color of men's skin, emancipation will be a proclamation, but emancipation will not be a fact. So, Joe, you were kind of getting that a moment ago. He's talking about the fact that 100 years prior, you have the Emancipation Proclamation, which frankly doesn't end enslavement, right? But gets the ball rolling in that regard. But again, you can see some great connections here to what Dr. King says in August of 1963, where he talks about 100 years later, using his language, the Negro is not yet free. We stand in the symbolic shadow of this man. So again, what I love about the language and rhetoric of President Kennedy, President Johnson, and Dr. King is you see these men who are keenly aware of not only the power of language, but also aware of history and how that history very much connects with the present, and how we can use that history to make changes for folks going forward. So we talked in the previous episode about why Johnson chose civil rights in the immediate aftermath of President Kennedy's assassination. And ultimately, you do have the passage of the Civil Rights Act in '64, and as we've talked about previously, the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Yeah.
So, Joe, from your perspective, what are the long-term legacies of both the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act of '65?
We have come a long way, but we still have so much longer to go. The Voting Rights Act is reflective in the politics of today, with the reconstructing of voting districts, with a lot of people believe that the Voting Rights Act is being restricted now, that Lyndon Johnson's dream of everybody being able to vote is being violated by, one political party or another. And so it's direct correlation today. 50, almost 60 years later, it's still being felt. And civil rights, with what was going on a few years ago with marching in Charlottesville, Virginia, about, hot button issues about monuments and about beliefs of the lost cause against, what is realities today. And it's just, it never is going to stop, I don't believe, until I don't know I don't think it will ever be a final achievement of equality. And I know Lyndon Johnson, one of our questions that we ask people when I give interpretation of the Texas White House, I say, do you think Lyndon Johnson would be saddened, or would he be emboldened, or would he kind of just say, well, this is what I kind of expected about what's going on with civil rights today, with the restricting of voting rights, with, voting, people not believing that the vote counts. People are saying that it's fraudulent. I don't know if Lyndon Johnson would, I think he probably would say, well, that's probably the way I would think about it. I mean, he probably would think, well, it doesn't surprise me whatsoever, because he saw the political realities. In 1964, Lyndon Johnson would say that he knew that the Voting Rights Act was going to lose the South to the Democratic Party for 100 years. It was kind of in the movie On the Way with Bryan Cranston, who plays Lyndon Johnson. He tells Vice President Humphrey, "This is not a cause for celebration. I just know that I just lost the South to the Democratic Party for 100 years." And so he understood it was something that needed to be done. However, he understood also that the negative side is that there'd be a lot of things not be the same within the Democratic Party again, or within Congress again. But it's something that he would have to do. He knew there was no other way but to get a civil rights bill passed. Like I said, he was a person that was directly affected by being an outsider, and so he understood, or he believed, he emphasized with minorities who were outside society, and it was a big influence on Lyndon Johnson.
I think those are all great points, and I think, as you were suggesting too, that for folks who are looking at American history, you sort of, obviously the fights for civil rights is going on even before the nation is founded, right? When you have folks who are being subjugated, whether they're being brought here in chains or whether you have indigenous people who are losing their land, the conversation about that is ongoing. And I think it's sped up as a result of the Civil War. You have the period of Reconstruction that, as you said a moment ago, put the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments on the docket. But then simultaneously, it's really the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act.
President Lyndon B. Johnson signs the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. in attendance.
Not only visitors, but also my students when I'm teaching the rest of the year, is that even though you have the 19th Amendment of the Constitution that's passed in 1920, where women get the right to vote, that's white women by and large. And so for African Americans, they're not, African American females rather, and indigenous women, they're really not going to have the right to vote until 1965. So those are sort of key pieces there. And Joe, as you said, the discussion goes on, whether it's Supreme Court decisions or gerrymandering or what have you. And I think, as we were kind of getting at a few moments ago, you have a situation where this is where the past and studying the past is so important. It's so important to understand all the various stories about how these folks have done the thing. So, Joe, that's about as much time as we have for today. I think folks are well aware there's a lot of great things to read and to listen to about civil rights. One thing I encourage folks to do is there's a great interview that Walter Cronkite did just a few months before Lyndon Johnson passed away in 1973. You can find that on YouTube. And Johnson talks a lot about civil rights. It also has Johnson interacting with civil rights leaders in 1973. And I would argue, from Johnson's perspective, that is his biggest legacy. So I want to thank you folks for joining us today. We have one more episode left. Next time we'll be talking about the establishment of the national park sites and the presidential libraries and museums. So thanks for joining us. Take care of yourselves, and we'll see you next time.
Credit slides of white text on a black background roll, identifying and thanking those who appeared in the video and those who helped edit and produce the video series.